Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, screwdrivers from scratch. So today, like I said, we're going to be making screwdrivers from scratch. Just to catch you up on this whole project, this is part of a set of handmade tools that I'm building for my son Jake for his 21st birthday. Now, for more on the project as a whole and to see how this whole thing came together, click on the link in the cards and descriptions. Now on to today's project. It's just a good old standard forged flathead screwdriver, the type that's sometimes referred to as a keystone type screwdriver. By the way, in later videos, we're going to do a parallel face type, sometimes known as a gunsmithing screwdriver, and a Phillips head. But that's for a later project. All right, let's get on with it. I'll be making all of these from O1 steel drill rod that you can buy from Grainger or MSC or tons of other places. We'll use two different sizes, 1/4 inch and 3/16 inch. But depending on what size that you want to make, you can use any appropriate size of stock. First, I'll cut the steel to length. In this video, I'm trying to show you how you can make your own tools using fairly simple equipment. So I'll be cutting the steel by hand using a hacksaw. Now, while I'm not using a lot of super fancy tools, I am using a forge and an anvil. That doesn't mean you gotta run out and buy an anvil to do this project. If you want to try this and don't have blacksmithing tools, no problem. You can use MAP gas that you can get from Home Depot, a claw hammer, and some rusty old piece of scrap steel as an anvil. I showed how to cut the steel a minute ago, but it's actually easier to forge while the rod is uncut. Then cut the whole thing off later. The technique I'll use here is simple. Just lift one end off the anvil a few degrees, then cant the face of your hammer to the side, basically at the exact same angle as the rod is coming up off of the anvil. You don't need a protractor here, just eyeball it. Then gently whack it into taper. This barely qualifies as blacksmithing, it's so easy to do. Here I am repeating the process with the other piece of steel. And that's it, done. So now we've got two pieces. One thing to be aware of is that O1 steel hardens very easily, so if you're using a forge, stick it back in the forge, heat it a little, then turn the fire off and let it soften. This is called annealing, and it'll make the next phase of the project easier. Now I'll clamp the screwdriver in a vise and start filing. In real life I'd do this with a belt grinder, but for the sake of demonstration. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that this black stuff on the outside of the steel, it's called mill scale, is very hard. It'll wear out your file. So if you've got a crummy old file that you don't mind messing up a little, use the corner of that file to sort of dig in and hog the scale off. Then set that old file aside and then turn to a nice new sharp file to finish the work. Basically, you're just going to file that tip square, then file down the flats to get them symmetrical. Now, I could tell you an exact angle to do this, but really, it's just easier to look at an existing screwdriver to get the angle right. The thickness of the blade will depend on the intended use, but somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 thousandths of an inch is in the right range. Again, if you don't have measuring tools, just test it on a screw that you would imagine using this tool on. By the way, if you're wondering why anybody would want to make their own screwdriver when they can go down to Home Depot and, buy one for $6, there's several reasons. First, for the fun of it and making your own tools. Obviously, I'm doing this for kind of a little heirloom project for my son. But when you make a tool yourself, it gives you an intimacy with your tools that you just don't get from something you buy from a Chinese factory. But beyond that, if you do everything right, you can actually make a much higher quality tool and one that's tailored to something specific. Maybe an odd screwdriver for an old mechanical device or a gun you're working on or whatever it might be. So now comes the key part, heat treating. The reason I chose 01 for these screwdrivers is that it's surely the easiest steel in the world to heat treat. Watch what I do here. Again, I'm using a forge, but MAPP gas or even a propane weed burner might get you enough heat to do this. MAPP will for sure, propane weed burner kind of depends. In any case, I'll heat the steel to a cherry red color. Now, I'm actually aiming for about 1500 degrees. Colors look different depending on the ambient light, so I'll use this little magnet on a stick as a verifier. Steel goes non-magnetic at about 1425 degrees Fahrenheit, so once I see what the color looks like at that point, I'll go just a hair brighter and we should be fine. Then when you get to the right color, the right temperature, you just shove the whole thing down into oil. Now I'm using an engineered quenching oil, but peanut oil, transmission fluid, mineral oil, they'll all work. I'd recommend a vegetable oil over synthetics as the smoke's likely to be less toxic. And obviously you want to take safety precautions because you can set this stuff on fire. Now I'll run a file down the side of the blade. It should skate over the steel, not bite in. If it bites in, then something's gone wrong, so you need to just repeat the process, going a hair hotter. If the steel's nice and hard, you're ready to temper the steel. Now on these screwdrivers, I tempered them to 600 degrees for 2 hours, which is what's known as a spring temper. That means they're a little softer than, say, a knife blade would be, but they're also tough and springy, so they're less likely to break. You can do this in your oven at home at about 475 and you'll still be just fine. The blade will be, in theory, a little bit more brittle. The likelihood of snapping a properly made screwdriver is near zero. So when I say they're more brittle, I don't mean you need to treat them like glass rods. They'll still be plenty tough. Next, I'll clean up the screwdrivers. You can do that by hand with sandpaper. An alternative method is to chuck them up in a drill press and just spin them around. This gives a nice even look. But you can just scrub up and down with a piece of sandpaper and maybe a little steel wool or Scotch-Brite, and it'll come out great that way too. Now we're ready to make the handles. In real life, I actually made the handles for all of my son's screwdrivers in a wood lathe, but I'll show that process in the next video. For this video, I'll show that you don't have to do it that way at all. You can do it with really simple tools. As soon as that video posts, by the way, I'll put a link to it in the cards and description, and you can see how I did it on the actual screwdrivers that I gave my son. Anyway, this will be pretty simple. I'll just take a piece of squared maple and mark the center. Then I'll drill a hole corresponding to the size of the screwdriver shank with a hand drill. Now I'll break the corners using heavy grit sandpaper. If you have a plane handy or a rasp, that'll save you some effort. I'm keeping this relatively square, which is pretty common on wooden handled screwdrivers. Some tapering and rounding. And we're there. Not much to look at, but it'll work. Once I've carved the handle, the shank of the screwdriver just slides in. Then I'll drill a 1/16 inch hole and insert a stainless steel cross pin to keep the shank from rotating. This is very important. Otherwise, even if you epoxy it in or whatever, the handle will eventually pop free when you're cranking on a screw. The shank will rotate, and then the whole thing's useless. By the way, this is why you don't want to harden the entire shank. If you did, you wouldn't be able to drill this hole through it. At this point, you can sand it with finer grit sandpaper and finish it however you want. And here's the final result. Like I said, in the real project I did for my son Jake, I did a bit of a fancier job on the handle. In this case, these are pieces of walnut that I made from scrap left over from a rifle stock I made a few years ago. Check the next video in the series to see how these handles were turned. I did a variety of screwdrivers for Jake's toolbox using different techniques. I'm a big fan of demonstrating that you can get similar results using totally different gear and techniques. So in the next video, we'll do some parallel blade screwdrivers, often referred to as gunsmithing screwdrivers, using much more tool-intensive techniques. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.